In 2025, the Falcons are making the same bets on the quarterback, the coaches, and the defense. But here's why it might finally pay off.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this podcast. Been podcasting for over a decade. Appreciate all of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day, and all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So as I record this on this Memorial Day, we're going to I'm in the mood to kind of look back as a way to look forward. And we're going to be talking about how the Falcons are making very similar, if not the outright same bets that they made a year ago on 3 things: the quarterback, the coaches, and the defense. And I'll explain why this time it might just be different. But let's start talking with the quarterback, right? For the 4th year in a row, the Falcons have a brand new starting quarterback. And for the 4th time in a row, they're betting that the new guy is going to be an upgrade over the old guy, and that will be their path to success. And finally, it might pay off. And the reasons why is because Michael Penix is going to elevate the explosive potential of this offense like we haven't seen from a very long time here in Atlanta. And if you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, or you're new here and plan to listen to this podcast for the future amount of time, you're going to have to make peace with the idea that I'm a big believer that explosiveness is everything when it comes to NFL offenses. And you can draw a direct line between the teams that win the most and the teams that have the best offenses in the league. You can draw a direct line from the teams that have the best offenses in the league to the teams that are the most explosive in the league. And when you find exceptions, it's usually teams that have like Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes under center. And with the Falcons, the explosive potential is off the charts with Michael Penix under center. His arm talent, his ability to unlock every level of the offense and attack every level of the defense could be huge for the Atlanta Falcons and their offensive potentials. We've already talked about this on the pod, but we'll reiterate this with the deep ball and how, based off of last year, his tendency to push the ball down a lot more, a higher volume of his passes are down the field throws, 20-plus yard throws than it was with Kirk Cousins. And just on average, based off of attempting those deep passes, assuming that he hits them at a similar rate, that should lead to one more explosive play per game, a 20-plus yard play. And the tracking I've done over the last 15 years says that every drive that has an explosive 20-plus yard play averages about 4.25 points per drive. And so if you take that over the course of the season, that equals to about 72 points. And that would be the difference from the Falcons going from the 13th highest scoring offense in the league last year, which they were, to the 8th highest scoring offense in the league last year. Now, as we've also reiterated, other teams have coaches too. And eventually, if they're worried about Penix's ability to carve them up deep, they'll adjust, right? They'll try their best to take away that explosive play and that deep ball with playing those Fangio-style too high shells, that sort of defensive revolution you've heard us talk quite a bit about on this podcast and elsewhere over the last couple of years is designed to do that, right? It's designed to force you to dink and dunk. And that's going to be the biggest question with Michael Penix when it comes to that. The efficiency, the accuracy of attacking those underneath and intermediate throws. And you get a lot of pushback from certain fans and certain media people when you talk about Penix's inefficiency and inaccuracy, and they blame all that stuff on the drops and the lack of chemistry he had. And those were certainly factors with it, but it's also sort of piggybacking on a point I made the other day with Jarvis Davis on the podcast, where fans will say a thing initially, but then when you think about it, it's like, that doesn't make a lot of stuff. And sort of the idea that Penix doesn't have to work on his accuracy, doesn't have efficiency concerns. It's basically, when you go a layer deeper, it's basically saying Michael Penix has no flaws, right? That he's a fully formed, he came out of the womb, fully formed, fully developed, and has nothing. He's already one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, and he's not, right? He's a young quarterback. He's got things that he's got to improve on. With Penix, it's going to be the accuracy, which I think is based around his footwork being cleaner and more consistent. With other quarterbacks, it's decision-making, it's handling pressure, it's all those various things. But with Penix, it is the accuracy, and we're not going to get into it today. But, to me, a lot of this is just kind of the beginning of the QB battle lines being drawn, where we've seen this with every Falcon quarterback, where, I can remember in the days before social media with Michael Vick, this was the case. And certainly over the last couple of years in the advent of social media, where everybody's favorite pastime when it comes to getting on their phones and getting online is to argue about their team's quarterback with other fans of their team. It's my least favorite part of the fandom. And again, it sounds pretentious when I say it, but my only agenda here is not a pro or anti-Penix agenda. It is an agenda of truth, right? I'm just going to give you my honest opinion on the Falcons and Michael Penix on a daily, if not weekly basis. And some weeks you're going to think that I'm too harsh. Some weeks you're going to think I'm the opposite. And it is what it is, but don't take it personal when someone has a slightly different opinion about the Falcons quarterback than you do. But as we talk about Penix and going through those ups and downs that come with being a young quarterback, hopefully in his case, the ups will outshine the downs, right? And I think they can with Michael Penix. I'm a believer in Michael Penix's potential as a distributor, that I think the fully formed version of him is a quarterback, much like Kirk Cousins, just with a much stronger arm, that it's basically the idea that if you build it, but it's the idea that he will be a very good operator of a well-structured offense. And it's sort of that spectrum when you map quarterbacks on between being a distributor and a playmaker, right? And like Caleb Williams and Jalen Daniels comparatively are more playmakers. And I think Penix is more of that distributor, right? And, I think you contrast that a little bit going back to the last time the Falcons had a young quarterback that was going to potentially go through some ups and downs with Desmond Ridder, right? That Desmond Ridder was also more of that distributor. And at the time, it's funny because going back and watching the film of Desmond Ridder at Cincinnati, going up to that pre-draft process, I didn't really think his processing was all that watching the college film, but there was a lot of other people that evaluated quarterbacks that thought Ridder was a high-level processor, relatively speaking. And then that first summer, that first preseason back in 2022, there were some things that we saw from Ridder in those preseason games that made me think, oh, maybe these people were onto something with the processing. And ultimately, as we got more of Desmond Ridder, in that 23 season, we proved that the processing wasn't sort of where it needed to be. And I think I bring that up because I did think Penix was a very good processor based off of his college film, right? And I haven't talked enough about it just because I've lost a little bit of credibility when talking about processing thanks to the Desmond Ridder era. But I do think Michael Penix has the right blend of that processing, that mental makeup, that poise that he showed in those 3 games, coupled with the physical tools to be a very good quarterback in this league. And we talked about it briefly on the Atlanta Football Party not too long ago when talking about sort of what was that moment that stood out to you for Penix where you're like, I think the Falcons have something. And for me, it was that Tampa 2 hole shot he took at the beginning of the Carolina game, hitting Kadero Hodge. And everybody wows about the arm talent on that throw. But to me, it was more the decision-making that stood out to me because we spent the previous week talking about how Michael Penix couldn't diagnose the hole shot against Tampa 2. And he does that on like the 3rd play of the following game. And so basically you had something that was a major problem one week that was immediately solved the following week. And that to me is what really drives the hope and optimism that I have for Michael Penix this year, that growth and development that Penix will show over the course of a full season. And that to me is going to be a really big reason why this time it is going to be different. So we will wrap the conversation about the quarterback bet here, and we'll get back to the idea of Penix being that operator of a well-structured offense. And that gets us to our next bet, which is on the coaching staff, which is particularly going to be a Zac Robinson-based bet that the coaching staff bet big on themselves last year, and they're doing the same this year. And we'll talk about why that bet will potentially pay off for them this year as opposed to last year. And a lot of that will be thanks to the growth that Zac Robinson will have as a play caller as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night is delivering highlight-worthy moments and momentum shifts and can't-miss moments. And make sure that you are staying in the game with FanDuel, whether it's before tip-off or live during the game with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have so many ways that they can win with FanDuel. It's not just betting straight up, for Monday night's action between the Wolves and the Thunder, but you can bet other ways in terms of not just the team that's going to win, but who's going to make the first basket, which team is going to be the first to 30 points. It's all there for you at FanDuel and so many other ways to win, not just on the NBA, but upcoming NFL season, MLB, all that and more. So if you're new to FanDuel, it's a perfect time. FanDuel, it's a perfect time to sign up. All you got to do is head over to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if that bet wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So make sure you make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So I say that the coaching staff made a big bet on themselves where essentially Raheem talked that talk, but didn't quite walk the walk, right? Raheem basically came in saying that, hey, all we got to do is figure out the quarterback situation. And the rest of this team is already built. We're just a quarterback away. And Terry already built a playoff caliber team. And we're just a quarterback away from showing it. And it's on us as coaches to get that out of them. And they didn't quite get that out of them, right? And I'm not a big believer, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, I'm not a big believer in blaming one thing for a loss. I think there's a multitude of factors and variables that, result in why teams win and lose football games. But you can at least order those things in one thing and put maybe one thing as the biggest factor in why a team won and lost a game, not the only factor in it. And I think that's a worthwhile exercise to illustrate this point I'm talking about, where, being disappointed with the coaching, where I would argue that 4 out of the Falcons' 9 losses were owed to the coaching being the biggest or number one factor in why the Falcons lost that game. You got the week 1 game against the Steelers, which was Zac Robinson's terrible, no good, horrible game plan. We call it the Bruno game because we don't talk about it, given how bad it was. You have the week 11 game against Denver, where that was the no-show game where everybody on the Falcons stunk in that game. And, I'm now at a point where I'm just going to blame Raheem Morris's decision to travel late to Denver that week. And so players weren't adjusted to the altitude. And that's the best explanation I have for why they came out so flat that week. But even if you don't like that as an explanation, Sean Payton and Vance Joseph, to a lesser extent, put on a coaching clinic and outcoach this coaching staff by a wide margin. So either whether you think it's the travel or the altitude or just not getting the team prep to play, the coaches were the number one reason, in my humble opinion, to losing that Denver game. And then you have the week 17 game against Washington, where obviously Raheem Morris's poor clock management was the number one reason why the Falcons lost the game. Not the only reason, but the number one reason. And then you have the week 18 loss to Carolina, where I explained on the All 22 review that week following that game, where the Falcons' defensive game plan was very similar to the game plan they had 3 weeks earlier against Desmond Ridder, where that team did not believe that Desmond Ridder could beat them with their arm. And they approached Bryce Young the same way, and Bryce Young made them pay for disrespecting him in that regard. And that ultimately, I think, led to the firing of defensive coordinator Jimmy Lake. And so, that's essentially proved that the bet on themselves that these 2 first-time coordinators were going to be successful, that bet failed, right? That Raheem did, bet on these 2 inexperienced coordinators, and one of them got fired and got replaced with Jeff Ulbrich. We'll talk more about him later in today's episode when we talk about the defense. And then the other one with Zac Robinson was a fine bet. I think Zac Robinson was fine, right? But that's all he was fine. Like Arthur Smith was fine. And I think Zac Robinson's version of fine was better than Arthur Smith's, but not to a significant degree. And thus the Falcons didn't get the massive upgrade at quarterback and coaching that Raheem talked a big game about. And those 2 things are related, right? The quarterback play being so up and down is related to the play caller being so up and down. And we're not going to get into all my Zac Robinson gripes on today's episode. But, to me, he went through his fair share of growing pains last year in his first year as a play caller, had a very up and down year. And hopefully now going into year 2, he's worked out all the kinks, right? That the majority of this year will be, ups versus downs, right? And we talked about how if you can look, one way to illustrate that is just looking at the explosiveness of the offense, right? You look at the 8 select games where this offense was very explosive. That 6-week span from week 5 to week 10 when this offense was humming, including the month of Kirktober, and then you throw in the Vikings game and the Panthers game at the end of the season. If you look at those 8 games, the Falcons average 5.5 explosive plays per game, which would have made them the most explosive offense in the NFL because the Baltimore Ravens averaged 5 20-plus yard plays per game, and they were number 1 in the NFL last year. But then when you look at the other 9 games, right, they averaged 2.2 explosive plays in those games, which would have been the least explosive offense in the NFL because the New England Patriots were number 32, averaging 2.5 explosive plays per game. And so that led to the Falcons basically being average in explosiveness. The NFL average was about 3.6 per game. The Falcons were 3.8. And my hope is that with the improvement of more play calling or play action, when the play call, we won't see as many lows with this offense moving forward when it comes to the explosiveness in particular, right? That we're hoping these year 2 jumps that we've seen Falcons offensive coordinators make consistently over the last decade, that we will see a similar one with Zac Robinson. And again, you can look at the explosive plays to illustrate that if you look at, those second years for these offensive coordinators dating back to Kyle Shanahan, and back in 2015 and 2016, and just look at the number of games where the offense was able to produce 4 or more explosive plays, which is above average, right? Kyle Shanahan and the Falcons offense in 2015 had 7 such games where they had 4 or more explosive plays in those games. That number jumped to 14 in 2016. Steve Sarkisian went from 9 in 2017 to 12 in 2018. Cutter went from 9 in 2019 to 11 in 2020. Arthur Smith went from 7 in 2021 to only 6 in 2022. So there was actually a regression. And then you have, what is that number for Zac Robinson and the Falcons in 2024? 6 games last year where they had 4 or more explosive plays, which is the lowest of any of these guys in year 1. And you're hoping that, similar to what we saw with Kyle Shanahan, where he doubled that number in year 2, you're hoping for a similar number for Zac Robinson in year 2, of 12 or more of such of these games. And that would be a huge boost to this Falcons offense. That when you look at those 6 games where they were able to get those explosive plays, the Falcons averaged 26 points per game, which would have been the 9th best offense in the league. In the other 11 games, they averaged about 21 points, which would have been the 21st best offense in the league in terms of point total. So basically the difference between a top 10 offense and a bottom 10 offense based off of how many explosive plays you're generating. And so, the thing that Shanahan and Sark and Cutter had in their back pocket was having Julio Jones, who was one of the most explosive players in NFL history, and that they always gave them a higher floor when it came to explosiveness, because they could just simply say, hey, Julio, go do something incredible, right? And you don't have a Julio Jones. The closest player you have to that is Bijan Robinson. And it's a lot harder for running backs to generate explosive plays than it is for wide receivers to do so, which to me puts more pressure on the play caller to make up the difference. That he can basically say, it's not about one guy. Julio, just basically go do something incredible. Anybody in this offense can do something incredible because of how well designed it is. And so, again, I think this play action passing attack that was mostly non-existent for the Falcons in 2024 is hopefully going to be much more existent in 2025 to raise that floor for this offense. And we've talked about the 3 things that we need to see from Zac Robinson in 2025, which is increased play action, diversifying the run game, and being able to marry that diverse run game with your play action concepts. We haven't seen that yet. We're hoping that we're going to see that this year. And Zac Robinson is saying all the right things. He was on the Check the Mic podcast with Sam Monson and Steve Palazzolo talking about these very things. So he's saying it. He's talking the talk. Now you got to walk the walk. And so it's just simple things, right? We were talking on the Locked On Falcons Discord over the weekend. Link in the description below if you want to join the conversation. But we were talking about one of the Falcons' favorite run plays last year was that insert run play where they would have Charlie Warner or Ray McLeod or Drake London insert as a lead blocker. Again, not going into my gripes. It'd be a lot easier if you just had a fullback. But again, that's an Aaron Freeman issue, not necessarily a Zac Robinson issue. But we didn't see a single play action concept built off of that run play all last year. And you saw the Rams do it all the time with Puka Nacua serving as that sort of insert blocker in 2023. And we thought we would see a lot of that, or at least I thought we would see a lot of that in 2024, and we didn't quite see that. And so, as we often say, beggars can't be choosers, better late than never. if we get that in 2025, all will be forgiven when it comes to Zac Robinson. So that is the conversation about the coaching. When it comes to the offensive side of the coin, we'll flip that coin and talk about the defensive side of things, where we're going to get more into Jeff Ulbrich and what he's bringing to the table as a play caller, as well as talking about whether or not this Falcon team has upgraded their talent level on that side of the ball. But the bet that the Falcons are making is very similar in that they're hoping to play complementary defense, and we'll discuss how and why that can pay off for them this upcoming season as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as I said, the Falcons want to play complementary defense, meaning that, they expect their defense to complement what their offense is doing, right? That this is not a defense that's going to stand on its own, right? Last year we called it like, this is not going to be a good defense, but maybe it's good enough to win games. And Jeff Ulbrich has basically said this when he's talked about the defense in the pass rush, where he expects the Falcons to play with a lot of leads. And that's a big bet, as we just discussed, on the offense being able to carry the bulk of the load for this team in 2025. And that's going to force defenses, or opposing offenses, to be one-dimensional when they're playing from behind, as the Falcons have those leads. And that's going to allow this attacking front and this defense to pin their ears back and get after the quarterback, thus unlocking this pass rush that has been non-existent for the most part in Atlanta for the last 2 decades. And this is a similar formula that worked for the Falcons in 2016, where they were able to play with a lot of leads and force teams who abandoned the run in the third quarter. The 2 teams that had the most number of snaps in that 2016 season, where they were up 2 or more scores in the second halves of games, were the New England Patriots and the Atlanta Falcons. They were like 2.5 to 3 times the league average that year in terms of those number of snaps. And those were the 2 best teams in the league that year. And so, as you can probably guess, the Falcons did not shine in this area last year. They were 19th in terms of how many plays they had last year in the second halves of games when they were up 2 or more scores. And I don't have to necessarily explain to you why that's so advantageous to team success. Oh, like you're up 9 or more points in the second half, that's going to lead to you winning a lot of games. Yeah, I don't need to break that down for you. But, to better illustrate that, if you want that groundbreaking, if you don't believe me when I say that, 13 of the 14 playoff teams were in the top 16 in this specific metric of up 2 or more scores, number of plays, you're up 2 or more scores in the second half. 15 of the 16 teams that had winning records were in the top 17 in that metric. All right. And the one outlier in both cases was the LA Rams, which I'm guessing, without having done a detailed dive of it, is probably because the Rams have good coaching and good situational football, which, as we discussed earlier, was not a strength of this coaching staff last year. But we're hoping they can port some of that Rams mojo that they seemingly lost in the mail. It got shipped to Atlanta. It just got delayed in shipping to all the stuff going on with the chains and supply chains and all that stuff. So it's finally going to arrive in Atlanta this upcoming season. But if the Falcons find themselves in close games, they will be able to take advantage of that. And I think they will be in a lot of close games this year. So hopefully they will take advantage of that. But, when we talk about this defense, the hope is they're getting an upgrade in the coaching from Jeff Ulbrich's simple attacking scheme. That simplification is basically hopefully going to lead to more contributions from the young players in 25 than they got in 24, where there was a nothing burger when it came to the young players on defense in 24 in terms of their contributions, and everything in 25 is kind of riding on these young players contributing. And that's why you've heard them say, we're going to be intentional about playing these young guys. And you have 4 2025 draft picks that are expected to have significant roles and potentially, carve out starting roles for this team, coupled with 3 2024 draft picks on defense that are going to finally get their chance to shine this upcoming season. Not to mention several 22 and 23 draft picks that are hoping for breakout years in year 3 and 4, like Arnold Ebiketie, Clark Phillips, Zach Harrison, among others. So this is nothing new. The Falcons have been betting on and hoping for breakout seasons from their young defensive players for several years now, and it hasn't quite delivered, but they're hoping it does this time. And that gets us to the whole conversation about, is this defense more talented than previous defense? And this is going to be one of probably several controversial things I'm going to say on today's episode, but maybe the most controversial. I don't think the Falcons defense is that much more talented heading into 2025 than they have been in recent years, right? And or at least I think the bets that they're making from a talent standpoint are very similar to what they were making last year. We talked about this during the free agent period, where a lot of their key defensive free agent additions or just reskinned versions of the same players that they were betting on last year. Like Leonard Floyd is a reskinned Matthew Judon. They're both 32-year-old pass rushers that have very good sack numbers. But when you look at the more advanced pass rush metrics like win rate, it shows clear signs of regression and decline over recent years to the point that their win rates are identical. The 2 years for Matthew Judon leading to his arrival in Atlanta, nearly identical to the 2 years that Leonard Floyd has leading to his year in Atlanta. Morgan Fox and Grady Jarrett being similar in the sense of, Grady's the better run defender, but they're probably similar in terms of what they provide as pass rushers at this stage in their careers. Divine Diablo and Troy Anderson being reskinned versions of the same player. Young athletic linebackers that were converted from different positions from college and hoping that speed and coverage ability translates on the defense. Mike Hughes being the other starting outside corner last year, same as this year. Now, I don't think Jordan Fuller is a reskinned version of Justin Simmons. That's the one kind of difference that you're looking at. But this is one of the reasons why, overall, we weren't necessarily as in love with the free agent moves because it felt a little too complacent. It felt a little too samey to what they have done in the past that didn't quite work out for them last year. And this isn't just a free agent thing. It kind of extends to the draft, right? That is notable that the 4 picks that they made were at 2 positions, edge and safety, which are the same positions that Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons played last year or played this year as well. But, those same positions where we were looking to those guys to be major needle movers for this defense in August when they acquired those guys after a quiet free agent period. And the Falcons weren't as quiet this free agent period. But as I said, it wasn't a whole lot that got you excited about what they did in free agency, that they mostly held serve or made lateral moves at positions like D tackle and linebacker and corner. And now the Falcons are expecting, a pair of edges instead of one in Judon and a pair of safeties instead of one in Simmons to really move the needle. And the reason for that is, 2 heads are better than one, that sort of notion. But the idea of having youth and speed and athleticism and hopefully improved coaching and play calling will allow those guys to be more needle movers in 25 than they were in 24. Like, that athleticism and speed is going to help you better handle the mobile quarterbacks. Like one example was that Washington game where basically Washington midway through the second quarter was like, they can't stop Jaden Daniels from running, and we couldn't stop Jaden Daniels from running. And, I've seen stats that said basically Jaden Daniels in that one game had the best game rushing as a quarterback than any quarterback in the league had rushing against any defense in the league that year. And hopefully we will leave stats like that signify how bad the Falcons defense was. We'll leave those behind in 2024. We'll not be bringing those into 2025. Hopefully the Falcons are going to have real juice off the edge as well as up the middle when it comes to their pass rush, right? We've talked about how Jalen Walker can potentially be a force playing alongside Caden Ellis as that A or B gap blitzer, as well as James Pierce having that fastball off the edge in addition to whatever Floyd and Arnold Ebiketie give you. We've talked about the improved potential play calling where, again, simple equals probably more man coverage, even though we saw this secondary get cooked from time to time in the back half of the season when the team was playing more press man coverage, particularly after the bye week. It led to greater overall success for this secondary and this defense and its coverage, and hopefully disrupting the timing of the plays won't give up those easy completions. When we're playing that press man coverage, we're disrupting the timing of the plays at the line of scrimmage and not playing off coverage that are just going to give up the easy completions like we saw where opposing quarterbacks were completing close to 75% of their passes against the Falcons throughout last year. And, having that aggressive front, right, bridging the sort of sim pressures that the Falcons majored in last year that were effective for this defense last year, and bridging that with the stunts and twists that were something the Jets majored in, in the past under Jeff Ulbrich. And we can see more of that. We saw this with Arnold Ebiketie and Grady Jarrett, where they were very good working those stunts, right? Some of their best work was working in tandem on those stunts. And hopefully we can get that going again with Arnold Ebiketie and whoever the D tackle, whether it's Fox, Brook Aurora, or whoever replaces Grady Jarrett in that role. Leonard Floyd, we've talked about how the vast majority of his sack production last year came as a looper and a cleanup guy on stunts. We know that James Pierce and Jalen Walker have the athleticism and speed and burst and closing ability to be effective on those stunts. And that's going to allow this pass rush to get home. And so we still have questions on this defense. What about the run defense? Is it going to hold up? The Falcons were weak against the interior run last year when teams wanted to run downhill between the tackles. They couldn't really stop it last year. That was something that the Jets were also weak in. And changing the scheme doesn't seem like it's going to solve that problem. But again, Falcons are playing with leads. That becomes less of an issue. We still don't know if the cornerbacks are going to hold up, right? Is Mike Hughes going to put together another solid year? Who's going to be your nickel corner, right? Is that player, whoever that player is that player going to be an asset, or is he going to be a liability like D. Alford was for most of the last season, right? But again, despite those questions, if the pass rush is able to get home, it's going to make things a lot easier for whoever's covering on the back end. So we can see the path where it all works in the Falcons' favor. Even though we have those question marks, you can still see that path to success. And that applies not just to the defense, but the team overall. And again, a lot of the same similar bets. But as I said earlier, this time it's going to be different. So full disclosure and transparency, I still remain skeptical if it's going to pay off for the Falcons. I still am skeptical if it's going to pay off in a way where it doesn't result in another 7 or 8 win season for this Falcon team, but at least I can see the path forward and why it could lead to a winning season, a playoff season, something that we've all been hoping and searching for these last 7 years. And unlike past seasons, I don't know if you have to squint to sort of see that path to success. So I think the optimism that people have at this stage in the offseason is justified. We just need to see if this Falcon team can deliver, and that's nothing new with the Atlanta Falcons. It's always about optimism. We always sit here saying, oh, this is their division to lose, and it's going to pay off and it's going to deliver, and it hasn't quite. And it has in the first 8 weeks of the season, because basically by week 8 in each of the last 3 years, the Falcons have been in first place in the NFC South, and then it all comes falling apart, right? And that's one area where you can argue maybe having a young group of players is potentially going to be advantageous because they don't even know any better, right? Where Michael Penix is going to be finishing strong as he gets more reps as the season wears on. Zac Robinson is going to have a well-established identity by that point in the season, know what works and what doesn't based off of what we saw in the first half of the season. And then you have the young players, hopefully will not be hitting the rookie wall, but they get those reps, and we'll see that pay off for them playing their best football in November, December, and into January. So we will see if it delivers for the Atlanta Falcons. Can Michael Penix deliver and be that uncharacteristically efficient and consistent young quarterback? Can Zac Robinson go from middling play caller to one of the top ones in the league? And can this defense be that complementary, quote unquote, good enough defense that they need in order to win these games? I think all of these bets can pay off, but we will just have to sort of see. So that is going to end it for us here today, guys. We will be continuing more of these conversations as the week unfolds with various guests. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen here by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, aka the Draft Dudes, are going to make you the most informed fan as you get geared up for training camps later this summer. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.